The large hall inside the music academy was filled with expensive smells. It was a mix of rich perfume, polished wood, and hot coffee. The room was beautiful, with high ceilings and gold trim on the walls, but it felt cold. It was the kind of place where people spoke in soft voices, not because they were quiet, but because they wanted everyone to know how important they were. Tonight was the winter recital. This was the biggest night of the year for the families who sent their children to this school. For the parents, it was a competition. They weren't just there to hear music. They were there to see whose child was the best, whose suit cost the most, and who had the most expensive seats. In the center of all this sat a woman dressed in heavy silk. She adjusted the diamond necklace around her neck and frowned. She looked at the printed program in her hand and tapped it with her red fingernail. "He is playing the piano." She asked the man sitting next to her. "I thought this was for the advanced students. I was told my daughter would be following a professional." The man, her husband, shrugged and looked at the paper. "It says he is a scholarship student. From the city orphanage. Probably some charity thing. The director likes to do that once a year. Makes the school look good," the woman sighed loudly. "Great. We have to sit through a struggling performance just so the school can pat itself on the back. I hope he doesn't ruin the mood for the rest of the night." All around the room, similar conversations were happening. People were checking their expensive watches. They were drinking from plastic cups of wine. They were impatient. This crowd was used to perfection. They were used to paying for the best teachers, the best instruments, and the best clothes. They didn't like surprises. They certainly didn't like the idea of a child with no family taking the stage where their own children played. Backstage, the air was different. It smelled like dust, floor wax, and old velvet curtains. It was dark, lit only by a few dim bulbs in the ceiling. While the other students were warming up their fingers and chatting with their parents, one boy stood alone in the corner. His name was Adrian. He was 10 years old, though he looked smaller because he was thin. He didn't have the bright, healthy look of the other children. His hair was clean, but cut in a simple, hurried way. He wore a black suit jacket that was a size too big for him. The shoulders sagged down, and the sleeves were a little too long, covering half of his hands. The pants were slightly short, revealing his white socks. It looked like he was wearing clothes meant for someone else, which he was. It was the best suit the orphanage had. Adrian stood very still. He was holding his music sheets tight. His knuckles were white. He didn't look like the other kids who were jumping around or looking nervous. He looked like a stone. He was silent. He had not spoken a single word to anyone since he arrived at the orphanage a year ago. No one knew exactly what had happened to him before that. The social workers said it was bad, but they didn't share the details. They just said he had closed himself off from the world. For the first 6 months at the orphanage, Adrian didn't play. He didn't smile. He didn't even look at people. He just sat in the corner of the common room and watched the dust float in the sunlight. Then, one rainy afternoon, the old piano in the corner of the room caught his eye. It was out of tune. Some of the keys stuck when you pressed them. It had scratches all over the wood. But when Adrian sat down on the bench, something changed. He pressed a key, then another. He didn't know how to read music then, but he could hear a melody in his head. He just needed to find it on the keys. The staff at the orphanage were shocked. They watched him play for hours, forgetting to eat dinner, forgetting to go to bed. They called a music teacher, who came in once a week to look at the old instruments. The teacher, a kind old man named Mr. Thorne, sat and listened to Adrian. He saw the way the boy's fingers moved. He saw the look in Adrian's eyes, intense, focused, and full of a deep kind of sadness. "This isn't normal," Mr. Thorne had told the orphanage director. "He doesn't just play the notes, he feels them. It is like he is talking through the piano because he cannot speak with his mouth." Mr. Thorne worked with him for months. He taught him how to read the notes on the page. He taught him how to sit properly. But mostly, he just let Adrian play. The boy learned fast. He learned so fast that Mr. Thorne decided to enter him into the city recital. It was a bold move. The other students in the competition had been taking lessons since they were 3 years old. They had grand pianos in their living rooms. Adrian had a broken piano in a dusty room. But Mr. Thorne believed in him. Now standing in the dark wings of the stage, Adrian felt his heart beating against his ribs. It was beating so hard he thought the people in the front row might be able to hear it. He peeked through the heavy curtain and saw the crowd. He saw the bright lights shining down on the shiny black Steinway piano in the center of the stage. It looked like a monster. It looked much bigger than the old piano at the orphanage. The current student on stage was a girl named Victoria. She was dressed in a velvet gown that looked like a princess dress. She played a fast, complicated song by Mozart. She didn't miss a note. Her fingers danced on the keys. When she finished, the crowd clapped politely. It was the kind of clap that said, "Good job, you did what you were supposed to do." She bowed, her dress sparkling, and walked off the stage. As she passed Adrian backstage, she didn't look at him. She was too busy looking for her parents. Adrian pulled his head back behind the curtain. He felt very small. He felt like he didn't belong in this world of silk and gold. He looked down at his hands. They were rougher than the other kids' hands. There was a small scar on his thumb from where he had fallen on the playground months ago. "You are on, Adrian," a stage manager whispered. He didn't smile. He just pointed a finger toward the stage. Adrian took a deep breath. He picked up his music sheets and walked out of the safety of the dark wings. The light hit him like a wall. It was bright and warm. He couldn't see the audience anymore. He could only feel them. He walked to the center of the stage. The sound of his dress shoes clicking on the wood floor echoed through the hall. It sounded like a lonely sound. Click, click, click. As he walked, a murmur went through the crowd. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was a sharp one. People sat up straighter. They saw the suit that didn't fit. They saw the messy hair. They saw the look of fear on his face. "Is that the orphan boy?" Someone whispered loudly from the front row. "Look at him," another voice said. "He looks terrified. Why are they putting him through this?" The woman in the first row, the one with the diamond necklace, leaned back in her seat and crossed her arms. She looked at her husband with a knowing look. "Here we go," she whispered. "Prepare yourself for a disaster." Adrian reached the piano bench. It was high and leather. He climbed up and adjusted the seat. He had to slide forward to reach the pedals. His feet dangled just a little bit off the floor. He looked like a small bird trying to land on a branch too high up. The room was not silent anymore. There was a feeling of impatience. People were shifting in their seats. Someone coughed. Another person tapped their foot. They wanted him to play so they could get it over with. They expected him to be bad. They expected him to make mistakes. They wanted a reason to say, "See, talent is something you are born with, and you can't just find it in an orphanage." Adrian did not look at the people. He did not look for a friendly face in the crowd because he knew there wasn't one. He just stared at the black and white keys in front of him. They were so clean. They were so perfect. He took another breath and let it out slowly. He thought about the dusty orphanage. He thought about the silence he lived in every day. He thought about the music that lived in his head. He placed his right hand on the keys. He placed his left hand on the keys. The room grew quiet, waiting for the first clumsy note. But Adrian didn't move yet. He just sat there, gathering his courage, ready to show them what he couldn't say with words. The air inside the concert hall felt heavy, like the atmosphere just before a thunderstorm, but there was no rain coming. The tension was purely human. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were locked onto the small boy sitting at the massive grand piano. He looked so small up there, hunched over the keys, his oversized suit jacket making him look like a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes in the front row. The woman with the diamond necklace let out a short, sharp breath. She checked her watch again, the shiny face catching the light from the chandeliers above. She was not interested in waiting. She had come here for an evening of perfection, to hear polished students play pieces that had been practiced for thousands of hours. She did not want to sit through a charity act. She turned her head slightly to her husband and whispered, though not quietly enough, "If this takes more than 5 minutes, I am leaving. I have an early morning tomorrow." Her husband nodded, looking bored. He tapped his fingers on his knee, already anticipating the mistake. He expected the boy to freeze. He expected the boy to hit a wrong note and burst into tears. That was the script these people had written in their heads. They saw an orphan, a child with no family and no proper training, and they assumed he had nothing to offer. They were waiting for the embarrassment so they could feel better about their own perfect, ordered lives. But on the stage, Adrian was not thinking about the time. He wasn't thinking about the diamond woman or the tapping man. For a moment, the world around him faded away. The bright lights stopped feeling hot and started feeling like a warm blanket. He looked down at the black and white keys. They were his friends. They were the only things in the world that never judged him, never asked him where he came from, and never told him to be quiet. They were waiting for him to speak. He took a deep breath. His right hand hovered over the keys for just a second. Then he brought it down. The sound that filled the hall was not the gentle, happy tune the audience expected. It wasn't a simple nursery rhyme or a cautious exercise. It was a chord, low, deep, and rumbling. It shook the floorboards of the old hall. The people in the front row flinched. The whispering stopped instantly. It was like a door had been slammed shut in a quiet library. The sound was aggressive. It was bold. It was loud. Then his left hand joined in. He wasn't playing the polite music of the conservatory. He was playing Rachmaninoff. It was a piece full of Russian sadness, full of storm clouds and struggle. It was music that required strength, a piece that demanded the pianist hit the keys with purpose, not just tap them gently. Adrian's fingers began to move. At first, they moved slowly, dragging the melody out of the piano like a heavy weight. The notes were thick and rich. They didn't sound like the thin, tinkling sounds the previous student had made. This music sounded like a heartbeat. In the second row, a man who was writing on a notepad looked up. He was a music critic who had heard hundreds of pianists. He was ready to write a scathing review about the charity case. He held his pen over the paper, ready to circle a mark for poor technique. But as the second phrase of music rang out, he froze. His hand didn't move. He recognized the sound immediately. It was the sound of someone who was not just playing notes, but someone who was bleeding into the instrument. On the stage, Adrian's eyes closed. He didn't need to see the keys anymore. His fingers knew where to go. He was remembering the dusty room at the orphanage. He was remembering the feeling of being alone. He poured all that loneliness into the piano. He played the anger he felt at having no parents. He played the fear he felt when the lights went out at night. He played the hope he found when he first heard music. Suddenly, the tempo changed. The slow, sad melody turned fast. It became a rush of notes, a cascading waterfall of sound. Adrian's right hand flew up the keyboard, dancing on the high notes. While his left hand pounded out the bass, the audience stopped checking their watches. The woman in the front row forgot about her early morning. Her mouth opened slightly. She had expected a disaster, but she was hearing something powerful. It was messy, yes. It wasn't perfect in the way a machine is perfect. The timing was slightly rushed here and there, driven by his emotion rather than a strict rhythm. But it was alive. It is hard to describe exactly what happened in the room during that first minute. It was as if a spell had been cast. The skepticism that had filled the air like thick smoke began to clear. The people who had leaned back in their seats, arms crossed in judgment, found themselves leaning forward. They couldn't help it. The music was pulling them in. A young man in the 10th row, who had come only to support his girlfriend who was playing later, looked at his phone. The screen was lit up with a notification, but he didn't care to read it. He stared at the stage. He saw the way the boy's body moved. Adrian wasn't sitting still like a statue. He swayed with the music. When the notes got high, his head lifted up. When the notes got dark and low, his shoulders hunched down. He looked like he was fighting a battle up there. The piano was singing. It was crying. It was shouting. The sound was so big that it seemed to bounce off the gold ceiling and come down to wrap around the audience. There was a moment, about 30 seconds in, where Adrian hit a run of notes that was incredibly difficult. It was a series of quick jumps that required the hand to stretch wide. A few of the wealthy parents in the crowd, who knew a little bit about piano, held their breath. They thought for sure he would miss. They thought his small hand wouldn't reach, but he didn't miss. He hit every single note with a sharp, clear attack. The sound rang out like a bell. The skeptical silence changed. It was no longer a silence of waiting for the end. It became a silence of awe. No one coughed. No one whispered. No one shifted in their chairs. The only movement in the entire hall was the rise and fall of Adrian's small shoulders as he breathed life into the instrument. Even the other students, waiting backstage, stopped talking. They peeked through the heavy curtains, their eyes wide. They knew how hard that piece was. They had practiced scales for years and couldn't play like that. They looked at the boy in the oversized suit and realized they had underestimated him. He wasn't the orphan boy anymore. Up there, under the lights, he was a giant. Adrian didn't know about the audience. He didn't know they were silent. He was lost in the story of the song. He was playing for himself. He was playing for every time he had been ignored, every time he had been passed over, every time he had felt invisible. And the piano was answering him. The piano was telling him that he was heard. The music swelled again, filling the huge room with a sound that felt like it was going to lift the roof off. The vibrations from the piano could be felt in the floor of the first row. It was raw. It was unpolished. But it was absolutely undeniable. The people in the expensive suits, with their expensive degrees and their expensive attitudes, were realizing something profound. They were realizing that you cannot buy talent. You cannot buy soul. And you certainly cannot buy the kind of magic that was happening on that stage right now. The piece moved into a quieter section, a delicate, fragile melody. Adrian's touch became featherlight. He caressed the keys, and the piano whispered back. The contrast was shocking. 1 minute it was a roar, the next it was a whisper. The control he showed was terrifyingly good for a boy his age. The critic in the third row finally put his pen down. He didn't need to write notes. He knew he would never forget this performance. He looked at the boy, really looked at him, and wondered what kind of life he had lived to be able to play like that. It broke his heart, and it fixed it. All at the same time. The woman in the front row had tears in her eyes, though she tried to blink them away. She wasn't thinking about her schedule anymore. She was thinking about her own children. They played well. They played perfectly. But they played like robots. This boy played like his life depended on it. As the first part of the performance came to a close, the hall remained trapped in that heavy, stunned silence. The judgment had evaporated, replaced by a strange new feeling. The crowd wasn't bored. They were captivated. They were witnessing the impossible, and they didn't dare look away. The heavy silence that had fallen over the room was not an accident. It was the result of hundreds of people realizing, all at once, that they had been wrong. The atmosphere in the hall had shifted completely. Just minutes ago, the air had been buzzing with judgment and impatience. Now, it was thick with concentration. The audience wasn't just waiting for the song to end anymore. They were leaning in, afraid to miss a single note. The piece Adrian was playing was difficult. It wasn't just that the notes were fast, though they were. It was that the music demanded a story. It demanded that the player pull emotions out of the air and smash them into the keys. Most pianists learned the mechanics first: where to put the fingers, how loud to hit, how fast to move. They learned the math of the music, but Adrian was playing by instinct. He was bypassing the math and going straight for the heart in the front row. The wealthy woman who had been so eager to leave had completely forgotten about her watch. Her arms, which had been crossed tightly across her chest in a defensive posture, had dropped to her sides. Her fingers were now gripping the velvet edge of her seat. She was staring at the boy's hands. They were small hands, not the hands of a master pianist. The skin was rough, and the nails were bitten short. Yet they moved with a power that seemed impossible for a child his size. She watched his left hand jump down the keyboard to hit the deep, booming bass notes. Every time he struck them, she felt a vibration in her chest, like a drum beating inside her ribs. On the stage, sweat began to gather on Adrian's forehead. The lights were hot, and the physical effort of playing such a demanding piece was intense. A drop of sweat rolled down his temple and threatened to fall into his eye. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't dare stop. He was in the middle of a long, complicated run of notes that required his fingers to stretch and twist in ways that looked painful. To the untrained eye, it looked like a blur of motion. But to anyone who understood music, it was clear that he was navigating a minefield without stepping on a single explosive. A man in the 10th row, a professor from the music conservatory, narrowed his eyes. He was known for being harsh, a man who failed students for having the wrong posture. He looked at Adrian's slumped shoulders, at the way the boy lifted his chin high when the music climbed. Technically, it was all wrong. His posture was terrible. But the sound was undeniable. The professor found himself holding his breath. He knew that if he tried to play this section with that level of intensity, his fingers would cramp up. He realized that this boy was playing with a raw, physical energy that conservatory students often lost after years of being told to sit up straight and be quiet. This boy was wild, and the music was better for it. The song entered a new phase. The chaotic rush of notes settled into a slower, more sorrowful melody. This was the part where the pianist had to be gentle. It required a touch so light that the hammers inside the piano barely kissed the strings. Adrian slowed his hands. He caressed the keys. The music drifted through the hall like smoke. It was a lonely sound. It was the sound of sitting alone in a room while the rain falls outside. The audience felt this loneliness. It was a strange feeling for such a crowded, successful group of people. They were used to being the ones who were happy, the ones who were comfortable. But as the melody floated over them, they felt a phantom sadness. They thought of things they hadn't thought of in years. They thought of lost pets, of old friends they stopped calling, of dreams they gave up on. Adrian wasn't playing his own story anymore. He was playing theirs. He was reaching into the crowd and pulling their hidden sadness out into the light. In the back of the hall, near the heavy wooden doors, a young couple stood listening. They hadn't been able to find seats, so they had leaned against the wall. The young man wrapped his arm around his partner's shoulder. He saw that she was crying silently. He didn't ask her why. He didn't need to. The music was explaining it perfectly. It was saying that life is hard, and that sometimes it hurts, but that there is beauty in the hurting. He squeezed her shoulder and rested his chin on her head, both of them swept away by the boy on the stage, even the children backstage. The ones who were Adrian's rivals were quiet. They had stopped making fun of his suit. They had stopped whispering about his background. They were peeking through the curtains with wide eyes. They knew how hard this piece was. They knew the hours of practice it took just to get the notes right. But hearing Adrian play it, they realized that knowing the notes wasn't enough. They realized they had been playing the music like a homework assignment. Adrian was playing it like a lifeline. Suddenly, the tempo began to pick up again. The sorrowful melody began to twist and turn, growing faster and more complex. The music was building toward a climax. Adrian's body began to sway more violently. The oversized jacket flapped a little as he moved. He was no longer sitting still. He was conducting the music with his entire body. When the notes got high, he practically stood up. When they crashed down low, he threw his whole weight into the keys. The sound grew louder. It filled every corner of the vast hall. It bounced off the portraits of old composers hanging on the walls. It shook the dust in the rafters. The audience could feel the pressure of the sound in their ears. It was overwhelming, but in a good way. It was like standing near the ocean when a massive wave crashes against the rocks. You feel small, but you also feel alive. The critic in the third row finally gave up on his notebook entirely. He closed it and laid his pen on top of it. He realized that no words he could write would capture this. He looked at the faces of the people around him. The skeptical woman was crying now, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. The bored man was sitting on the edge of his seat, his mouth slightly open. The whole room was united. For the first time that night, there were no rich people and no poor people. There were no orphans and no heirs. There was just a room full of humans, connected by the sound of a piano. Adrian's face was wet with sweat now. His arms were burning with fatigue, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He felt the music rising inside him like a bird trying to break out of a cage. He knew the hardest part was coming. The technical section that Mr. Thorne had warned him about. The part where the left hand and the right hand had to do completely different things. Moving in opposite directions at top speed, he took a quick, sharp breath. His fingers tensed. He launched into the final chaotic sprint of the song. The notes exploded from the piano. It was a blur of sound, a storm of arpeggios that cascaded up and down the keyboard. The audience gasped as one. It looked impossible. It sounded like magic. They held their breath, fearing that at any second the spell would break. They feared he would miss a note, that the music would stumble and fall. But Adrian didn't stumble. He flew. He was faster than the wind, stronger than the doubt that had greeted him. When he walked on stage, the skepticism that had hung over the hall like a dark cloud was completely gone. The judgment had evaporated, burned away by the sheer intensity of the boy's performance. The people who had looked down on him were now looking up to him. They weren't just impressed. They were humbled. They realized they were witnessing something rare. They were witnessing the moment a star was born, not in a fancy studio, but on a hard bench, under hot lights, in a suit that didn't fit. As the music raced toward its peak, the energy in the room became electric. It was no longer just a piano recital. It was an event. It was a moment in time that none of them would ever forget. The boy who had no voice was shouting at the top of his lungs, and for the first time in his life, the whole world was listening. The music was no longer just a sound. It was a physical force that seemed to push against the walls of the concert hall. Adrian had reached the middle section of the piece, the part where the melody became a story of deep tragedy and longing. This was not the flashy, fast part that showed off his fingers. This was the slow, painful part that showed his soul. The previous excitement of the fast notes had drained away, leaving a heavy, thick silence in the air. Adrian played a melody that was so soft it seemed like a whisper. He leaned his body close to the keys, as if he was telling the piano a secret that he couldn't tell anyone else. The sound was delicate and fragile, like a thin glass vase that might shatter if he touched it too hard. In the audience, the effect was overwhelming. The wealthy people who had been checking their phones and whispering were now completely paralyzed by the sound. The woman in the front row, the one who had been so annoyed by Adrian's presence earlier, felt a lump form in her throat that was too big to swallow. She thought of her own children, who were safe at home with their warm beds and their full bellies. She looked at this boy in the oversized suit, this orphan who had nothing, and she realized she had never truly heard sadness before. The silence in the hall was different now. Before, it was a polite, waiting silence. Now it was a heavy, suffocating blanket of awe. Nobody dared to cough. Nobody dared to shift in their seats. They were terrified that if they made a sound, the spell would break and the music would stop. The air conditioning hummed quietly in the background, but other than that, the only thing that existed was the sound of the piano weeping. Adrian's eyes were squeezed shut. He wasn't reading the music on the stand anymore. He couldn't see it even if he wanted to, because his vision was blurred with tears that he refused to let fall. He was playing from a place deep inside his memory. He was thinking of the orphanage common room on cold winter nights. He was thinking of the empty chair at the dinner table where a parent should have sat. He was thinking of the feeling of being invisible, of walking down a street and having people look right through you. He poured all those feelings into the keys. When he felt the sharp pain of loneliness, his hands struck the keys with a sudden harshness that made the audience jump. When he felt the gentle warmth of a rare kind word from a teacher, his touch softened into something impossibly tender. The music was alive. It was breathing. It was acting as a bridge between a small, lonely boy and a room full of strangers who thought they had everything high up in the balcony. An elderly man sat with his cane resting across his knees. He was a retired musician, a man who had spent his life teaching students how to play the notes perfectly. He had always believed that technique was the most important thing. You had to have the right posture, the right touch, the right timing. But as he listened to Adrian, he realized he had been wrong. Adrian's timing was not perfect by the clock. He held a note a fraction of a second too long here, and he rushed a beat there, but it didn't matter. It was wrong in a way that was more beautiful than being right. The boy was playing with human time, slowing down when the hurt was too much, and speeding up when the hope returned. The old man felt tears running down his wrinkled cheeks, disappearing into his white beard. He had never heard anything so honest in his 80 years of life. The woman in the front row was no longer leaning back in her seat. She was leaning forward, her elbows on her knees, her hands covering her mouth. The judgment had completely vanished from her face. In its place was a look of pure shock and heartbreak. She remembered a time when she was young and she had wanted something so badly. But her parents had told her she wasn't good enough. She had forgotten that feeling for 30 years, but this boy's music had dragged it back up to the surface. She realized that she and this orphan boy were not so different. They both knew what it felt like to be told, "You don't belong." The only difference was that he had found a way to roar back at them. She had just stayed quiet. On the stage, the music shifted again. The soft, weeping melody began to climb higher and higher up the keyboard. It was searching for something. It was reaching for the light. Adrian's right hand played a series of notes that were so high they sounded like bells ringing in the distance. His left hand kept a steady heartbeat rhythm in the bass. It felt like the music was trying to take off, like a bird running along the ground before it flies. The audience felt the tension rising. They were on a journey, and they knew the climax was coming. The music teacher from the conservatory, the one who usually critiqued every mistake, had stopped looking for errors. He was just feeling. He felt the hairs on his arms stand up. He felt a chill run down his spine, even though the room was warm. He realized that talent isn't about how much money you spend on lessons. It isn't about who your parents are. Talent is a gift, and it doesn't care where you live or what you wear. The room was so quiet now that you could hear the wood of the instrument creaking slightly under Adrian's weight as he swayed. You could hear the rustle of his jacket sleeves. The sound was immersive. It felt like the audience was underwater, and the music was the current pulling them along. They were no longer thinking about their money or their status. They were stripped of all their labels. Right now, they were just human beings listening to a story about pain and survival. A young girl, no older than 8, stood in the aisle near the back. She had come with her parents, but she had wandered away because she was bored. Now, she stood frozen, holding a half-eaten cookie. She didn't understand music theory. She didn't know Rachmaninoff from a nursery rhyme. But she knew what the music was saying. She knew it sounded like when you fall down and scrape your knee and you try not to cry. She knew it sounded like when you were lost in the store and you can't find your mommy. She put her cookie in her pocket and just listened, her big eyes never leaving the stage. The skepticism that had poisoned the room at the beginning of the night was gone. In its place was a profound sense of respect. The people who had looked down on Adrian were now looking up at him with wonder. They felt foolish for their prejudices. How could they have judged this child? How could they have thought that a suit or a family tree made a musician? They were witnessing the raw power of the human spirit. It was humbling them. The music grew louder again, building slowly toward the final storm. Adrian's movements became bigger. He wasn't just using his hands and fingers. He was using his entire body. He threw his weight into the piano, attacking the keys with a ferocity that was frightening to watch. The sound swelled, filling the hall until there was no room left for anything else. The sadness of the slow melody was still there, but it was changing. It was turning into strength. It was turning into a shout of defiance. The audience held their collective breath. They could feel the energy swirling around the stage. It was electric. It was dangerous. It was the most alive any of them had felt in years. They knew what was coming. They could feel the thunder approaching, and they knew with absolute certainty that they would never forget this moment as long as they lived. The boy who had nothing had just given them everything. The music inside the concert hall was reaching its final breaking point. Adrian's hands were moving across the piano keys so fast that they looked like a blur. The sound was no longer just sad or beautiful. It was intense and powerful. It was like a storm that had been building up for years was finally breaking loose. The deep, heavy bass notes shook the floorboards, while the high notes pierced the air like lightning. The audience was on the edge of total collapse. They weren't just listeners anymore. They were passengers on this ride. Their hearts were beating in time with the rhythm Adrian was playing. The wealthy woman in the front row had forgotten all about her expensive dress. She was gripping the armrests of her chair so hard that her knuckles were white. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her makeup, but she didn't care. The music had stripped away her vanity. It had stripped away her pride. All that was left was raw emotion. The piece rushed toward its end. Adrian's body was swaying violently, the oversized jacket flapping like a flag in the wind. He was pouring every ounce of energy he had into the instrument. He was playing for every lonely night he had ever spent in the orphanage. He was playing for every time he had been ignored or looked down upon. It was a roar of defiance against the world that had treated him like nothing. Then came the final moment. Adrian lifted both hands high above the keyboard. For a split second, there was silence in the music, a pause that felt like the whole world holding its breath. Then he brought his hands down, crashing onto the keys. He struck the final massive chord with all the strength his small body possessed. The sound that came out of the piano was enormous. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical wave that hit the audience square in the chest. It rang out loud and clear, echoing off the high ceiling and the gold walls, vibrating through the floors and the seats. It was a sound of triumph. It was a sound that said, "I am here." Adrian didn't lift his hands immediately. He left them resting on the keys, letting the vibration travel up his arms and into his body. He sat there, head bowed, chest heaving, completely exhausted. The sweat dripped from his nose onto the ivory keys. In the silence that followed the chord, the entire hall froze. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. It was a heavy, stunned silence. The kind of silence that happens when something so big has just occurred that the mind needs a moment to understand it. The spell was still holding them. They were afraid that if they moved, the magic would disappear. Then, a sound broke the silence. It wasn't a cough. It wasn't a whisper. It was the sharp intake of breath from the music critic in the third row. He let out a long, shaky exhale, dropping his pen completely. That small sound acted like a trigger. Suddenly, the room exploded. It wasn't the polite, slow applause that usually happens at these fancy events. It wasn't the clap because we have to noise. It was a roar. It started in the back and surged forward like a tidal wave. Every single person in the hall leaped to their feet at the exact same time. The applause was deafening. It was louder than the piano had been. Hands clapped together so hard they stung. People were shouting. People were whistling. The man in the front row was clapping so enthusiastically that his glasses fell off, and he didn't even stop to pick them up.
Bravo.
Someone screamed from the balcony. Bravo. The wealthy woman wasn't wiping her tears anymore. She was clapping and cheering, a huge, genuine smile on her face. She looked up at the stage with eyes full of wonder. She wasn't looking at an orphan boy anymore. She was looking at a hero. She was applauding not just the music, but the spirit of the child who had played it. The retired teacher in the balcony was clapping with shaking hands, tears flowing freely down his wrinkled face. He had seen thousands of concerts in his life, but he knew he had never seen anything like this. He knew he was witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime moment. On the stage, the noise slowly penetrated Adrian's exhaustion. He lifted his head slowly, looking around as if he was waking up from a dream. He saw the audience standing. He saw the hundreds of hands clapping. He saw the smiles and the tears. For a moment, he looked confused. He didn't understand why they were so happy. He had just played what was in his heart. Mr. Thorne, his teacher, walked onto the stage from the wings. He was beaming with pride, clapping as hard as anyone. He gently touched Adrian's shoulder, guiding the boy to stand up. Adrian stood on shaky legs. He was small and pale in his oversized suit, looking out at the sea of people. He didn't bow like a professional. He didn't know how to do a fancy stage bow. He just gave a small, awkward nod. He looked scared, but there was a tiny spark of light in his eyes now. A realization that he had been heard. He had been seen. The applause got even louder when he stood. It felt like the roof might cave in. It went on for minutes. Usually, the organizers would have brought the curtains down or started the music for the next act, but nobody moved. The technicians stood in the back with their arms crossed, watching and clapping. The other students stood in the wings, their faces flushed with admiration and a little bit of envy. They knew they had been outpla. Adrian turned slowly and walked off the stage. As he disappeared behind the heavy curtains, the applause didn't stop. It followed him into the darkness. Backstage, the air was cooler. He leaned against the wall and slid down to the floor, burying his face in his knees. He was overwhelmed. He didn't know how to process the noise and the energy, but for the first time in his life, he didn't feel lonely. The concert eventually continued. The next student came out, a very talented girl who played a difficult piece by Mozart. She played perfectly. Not a single note was out of place. She had excellent posture and beautiful technique. But the magic in the room was gone. The audience sat down, but they were restless. They kept looking toward the stage door, where the boy in the big suit had gone. They kept thinking about the raw, messy, beautiful sound they had just heard. After the recital was over, the mood in the lobby was strange. Usually, people would be chatting about the weather or their dinner plans. Tonight, they were talking about one thing only. Groups of people stood in circles, speaking in hushed, excited voices. "Did you see his hands?" a woman in a fur coat asked. "I have never seen anything like it." "He played like he was fighting a war," a man replied, shaking his head in disbelief. "Where did he come from?" The wealthy woman and her husband were walking toward the exit. The woman stopped. She looked at her husband. "We need to find out more about that scholarship program," she said firmly. "I want to help that boy. He deserves a chance. A real chance." Her husband nodded, putting a hand on her arm. "I was thinking the same thing. Maybe we can pay for a new piano at the orphanage. Or better lessons." Word spread through the crowd like wildfire. Offers began to form in people's minds. Music scholarships, private lessons, donations. The boy who had come with nothing had given them a gift. They hadn't expected. He had reminded them what passion really looked like. And now, they wanted to give something back. Outside, the night was cold and dark. The streets were wet with rain. A long black car pulled up to the curb to pick up the wealthy woman. Before she got in, she looked back at the theater entrance. She saw a small figure standing in the doorway. It was Adrian, waiting for the orphanage van. He was still wearing the oversized suit, holding his sheet music. She didn't go over to him. She didn't want to embarrass him. But she stood there for a moment, watching him. She saw him look up at the stars, a small, quiet smile on his face. He looked different now. He didn't look like a scared orphan anymore. He looked like a musician. The woman got into her car, but she kept thinking about that smile. She knew that the world had tried to silence that boy. It had tried to make him invisible. But tonight, he had made the world listen. And she knew deep down that this was just the beginning for him. The skeptical audience had fallen silent. Yes. But more importantly, their hearts had opened. And that was a music that would last long after the final chord had faded away.